In August of 1590, 3 years after a small English colony had been left on Roanoke Island, Governor John White finally returned. He had crossed the Atlantic expecting hardship, illness, perhaps hunger, maybe conflict. Instead, he found something stranger. The settlement was deserted. No bodies, no sign of battle, no desperate message scratched across a wall. Only one word, carved into a wooden post, Croatoan, and on a nearby tree, just 3 letters, Crow. For more than 4 centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists has been remembered as one of the first great mysteries in American history. A vanished colony, a missing people, a story suspended between history and legend. But was Roanoke really a disappearance without a trace? Or is the real mystery something else entirely? Because the more closely you examine the evidence, the less this story looks like a supernatural vanishing, and the more it resembles a slow collapse, a desperate relocation, and a truth that may have been buried under a far more dramatic legend. The popular version of Roanoke is simple. A group of English settlers arrived on an island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their governor returned to England for supplies. When he came back, the entire colony had vanished. That version is memorable because it is clean, it is eerie, and it gives history exactly what it loves, an unanswered question with just enough detail to feel haunting. But the real story is messier. Roanoke was not England's first attempt in the region. Before the famous Lost Colony of 1587, there had already been an earlier English outpost on Roanoke Island in 1585. That earlier colony struggled badly and was eventually abandoned. Roanoke was already a fragile experiment before John White's colonists ever arrived. And that matters, because Roanoke was never a stable settlement suddenly swallowed by the unknown. It was part of a larger English colonial effort that was underfunded, poorly supplied, geographically vulnerable, and deeply dependent on fragile relationships with indigenous communities. The English barely understood. By the time the 1587 colonists landed, the venture already had a troubled history behind it. These settlers, led by John White, were supposed to establish a colony farther north, in the Chesapeake Bay area. But that is not where they stayed. Instead, due in part to decisions made during the voyage, they ended up again at Roanoke Island. There, in the summer of 1587, the colony was re-established under conditions that were uncertain from the beginning. Among the settlers were men, women, and children. This was not merely a military outpost. It was meant to become a real English community in the New World. And within that fragile settlement, one moment would later take on symbolic significance: the birth of Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter, often remembered as the first English child born in the Americas. But symbolism does not feed a colony, and almost immediately, the settlers faced a problem that would define their fate. They did not have what they needed to survive. Food, supplies, long-term security, and reliable support from England were all uncertain. From the very beginning, Roanoke was less a thriving colony than a gamble. And like many gambles made from far away by people in power, it was the people on the ground who would pay the price. John White did not want to abandon the colony for long, but the settlers needed supplies, reinforcements, and support from England. So only weeks after the colony was established, White returned across the Atlantic to seek help. It should have been a temporary absence. Instead, it became catastrophic. England was preparing for war with Spain. Naval resources were being redirected. Ships were needed elsewhere. Plans changed, voyages were delayed, and White's attempts to return quickly to Roanoke repeatedly failed. 3 years passed. 3 years. In any colonial setting, that is an eternity. Food stores vanish. Alliances shift. Leadership weakens. Seasons turn hostile. Children grow. People die. People move. And whatever happened to the colonists of Roanoke likely happened in that silence, between the moment White sailed away and the moment he finally came back. When White at last reached the Outer Banks, in August of 1590, the date carried a deeply personal weight. He went ashore on August the 18th, his granddaughter Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. He had left behind his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchild. The missing colony was not an abstract political project to him. It was family. When White and his party examined the site, they did not find a scene of chaos. That is one of the most important facts in the entire case. The houses had been taken down. The fortifications were no longer in active use. The settlement had clearly been abandoned, but there was no obvious evidence of a violent attack. No burned ruins. No massacre site. No graves that conclusively explained the colony's fate. And critically, the carved word Croatoan appeared on a post, while Crow appeared elsewhere. This detail is often presented as eerie and cryptic, but according to later interpretation, White and the colonists had previously agreed that if they relocated, they would leave a sign indicating where they had gone. If they were forced away under distress, they were also supposed to carve a cross to indicate danger. No cross was found. That one missing detail changes everything, because if the colonists were trying to leave a message, and if that message pointed toward Croatoan, then Roanoke may not have been an unexplained disappearance at all. It may have been an evacuation, a planned movement, a survival decision, and yet White never confirmed where they had gone. Weather, ship conditions, and circumstances prevented a full search toward Croatoan. He was pulled away before the mystery could be resolved. That failure to follow the clue immediately may be one of the reasons Roanoke remained legendary. The message existed, but the confirmation never came. History was left with a word and a silence. And over time, silence became myth. To understand why the settlers may have abandoned Roanoke, we need to ask a more practical question. Why stay? Roanoke was vulnerable. Supplies were uncertain. English support was inconsistent. The settlement had no guarantee of rescue. The political and social environment around them was unstable. And this was not an experienced colonial machine. These were settlers trying to survive at the far edge of an imperial ambition that was still improvising itself. The idea that the colonists simply waited in place for 3 years, doing nothing, becomes harder to believe the more you think about it. A more realistic possibility is that they moved because they had to. They may have sought food. They may have followed local advice. They may have joined or divided among nearby indigenous communities. They may have tried to relocate north toward the Chesapeake, which had been the intended destination from the beginning. The most enduring explanation is also the one John White himself seems to have considered first. The colonists relocated to Croatoan. Croatoan generally refers to Hatteras Island and the Croatoan people who lived there. The carved word found at Roanoke strongly suggests that the destination mattered. It was not a random symbol. It was a place name, and likely a directional clue. This theory has several strengths. First, it fits the evidence White actually found. Second, it fits the prior arrangement about leaving signs. Third, it fits the simple reality that relocating to a friendlier or more viable location would have made sense. And fourth, later archaeological work on Hatteras Island has turned up artifacts that some researchers believe point toward contact or cohabitation involving English colonists. That last point matters. The modern evidence is intriguing, but not universally accepted. There is no single archaeological discovery that closes the case and proves, beyond doubt, that the entire colony settled permanently at Croatoan. What exists instead is a growing pattern of possibility, and that is enough to make the Croatoan theory feel less like folklore and more like the leading explanation, even if not the final one. Another major line of thought proposes that the colonists attempted to move to the Chesapeake Bay region, which had been their intended destination in the first place. This theory argues that Roanoke may have been temporary from the beginning, that once conditions worsened, the settlers resumed the original plan and relocated northward. There is a logic to this. If the colony had never truly wanted to remain on Roanoke, and if the island was already associated with failure, why not leave? Why not try to reach the more promising site they were supposed to occupy from the start? Some researchers have linked this idea to later map analysis, including attention paid to John White's map and the suggestion that concealed markings may point toward a planned settlement site, inland or away from Roanoke itself. But this theory also has problems. If the colonists had gone north in a coordinated way, why leave Croatoan as the clearest surviving clue? Why point toward one location if the main body had moved toward another? One possible answer is fragmentation. The colonists may not have stayed together. Some may have gone to Croatoan. Others may have attempted movement inland or northward. A colony does not have to disappear all at once, or in only one direction. It can break apart. And once that happens, the historical record becomes much harder to reconstruct. Of course, one of the oldest explanations is also one of the darkest, that the colonists were killed, whether by hostile conflict, retaliatory violence, or collapse into scattered deaths. This theory has persisted because it offers a blunt ending to an otherwise frustrating case. But there is a problem with it. The physical evidence White described does not strongly support a catastrophic attack at Roanoke itself. That does not mean violence played no role in the colonists' fate. It may have. But if they were attacked, it may have happened later, elsewhere, after they had already left the island. The distinction is important, because the iconic mystery of Roanoke is not just what happened to them, but what happened at the empty settlement White found. And at that site, the evidence suggests departure more than destruction. That does not make the story less tragic. In fact, it may make it more tragic. A massacre is terrible, but it is simple. A prolonged struggle to survive, moving between communities, losing cohesion, adapting, intermarrying, dying gradually, leaving no single dramatic ending. that is far harder for history to preserve. It is also far more likely to be forgotten. So if the evidence points away from a magical disappearance and toward a more human explanation, why does Roanoke still feel so mysterious? Because mysteries survive when records fail, and Roanoke failed at exactly the right point in history to become unforgettable. There was enough documentation to leave behind names, dates, and the carved message, but not enough follow-up to confirm what came next. Enough emotion to make the case powerful, but not enough evidence to make it closed. Enough ambiguity to invite theory, but not enough certainty to end the argument. There is also something profoundly American about Roanoke's afterlife. It sits near the symbolic beginning of English America. It involves a frontier landscape, a family tragedy, a failed colonial promise, and a missing answer at the dawn of what would later become the United States. In other words, Roanoke was never just a historical puzzle. It became a foundational myth, and myths resist ordinary explanations. A colony that slowly relocated, assimilated, divided, and disappeared into the surrounding world is historically plausible, but it is not as memorable as a vanished settlement with a single ominous word carved into wood. Legend prefers drama. History often prefers discomfort. Modern archaeology has made the Roanoke story more interesting, but not necessarily simpler. Finds on Hatteras Island have encouraged the view that at least some colonists may have integrated with local indigenous communities. Other work has drawn attention to inland evidence, including pottery and other material that some interpret as signs of relocation or dispersed survival, but the case remains contested. Artifacts can suggest presence, contact, or trade without proving the exact movements of every colonist. This is one of the hardest things about historical mysteries. Evidence rarely arrives with a label. A shard of pottery does not say who carried it. An iron fragment does not tell us whether it belonged to a colonist, was traded through indigenous networks, or arrived later through another route. Maps can conceal intention, but not always outcome. Archaeology narrows possibilities. It does not always end them. And yet, in a strange way, that ambiguity may bring us closer to the truth, because the truth was probably never a single event. It was likely a process, a colony under strain, a relocation, a blending of peoples and places, a failure of English plans, and then, eventually, a failure of English memory. So what really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? The most defensible answer is this: the colonists probably did not simply vanish. They most likely left Roanoke deliberately. At least some of them may have gone to Croatoan, where they hoped to survive with help from local indigenous communities. Others may have moved elsewhere, possibly inland or northward, either by plan or through gradual fragmentation. Some may have died. Some may have been absorbed into surrounding societies. And whatever remained of them may have ceased to exist as a distinct English colony long before anyone from England came looking in the right place. That answer is less dramatic than the legend, but it is also, in some ways, more unsettling, because it suggests the colonists were not erased in a single moment. They were lost more slowly than that. Lost to distance, lost to delay, lost to political indifference, lost to the fact that survival on a colonial frontier often required becoming something different from what England had intended. And perhaps that is why Roanoke still lingers in the imagination, not because the colony vanished without explanation, but because the explanation may force us to abandon the kind of ending we were hoping for. When John White stood in the ruins of Roanoke in 1590, he was not looking at an impossible event. He was looking at the aftermath of absence. The carved word he found, Croatoan, may not have been a warning from a mystery. It may have been an answer, just not one history was ready to accept.